So I originally came across some of your work when you were interviewed on a previous podcast, and your work is kind of this really interesting intersection of tech and therapy. And at first thought, one kind of thinks, how could they possibly go together? But as I've spent more time talking to you and more time understanding the connections, now I can't unsee the connection. So I'd love if we can talk a little bit about, before we get into the tech and therapy part, a little bit about you, a little bit where you're from, and a little bit of a self-intro.
No, well, thank you for the intro. My name is Rieko, and I was born and raised in Japan, but spent a whole chunk of time, I think around 10 years in Melbourne, Australia, which is, I believe, where you're from. I believe you must have crossed paths somewhere. It's not a big
That was
city.
you. Oh my gosh, no, I'm sure. The Australian Japanese community is very small.
It is indeed, yeah. And so I went back and forth in between Japan and Australia, and that's how I got to know different working cultures and business practices. But more so, when I was in Australia, I was working for a lot of different NPOs and NGOs where we were focusing on helping newly arrived refugees. And that's where I was fully interested in people's mental health, because it does matter a lot. And since I've been back in Japan, I took a little break from therapy because I was one of the core members of launching an e-commerce platform called Shopify in Japan. And I was fully committed that I did nothing else, which was really fantastic because I got the experience of building something from scratch. And but then again, I also understand the difficulties of launching a business in Japan, especially if you're not Japanese. And I do also understand the ripple effects of your mental wellness in that journey and after launching a business too. And so I just sort of wanted to kind of be the guide, the support for people who may be experiencing something similar to what I've experienced, or just people's well-being in general.
Thank you so much. So tell us a little bit about Shopify. So when you joined, it was actually a couple of years ago now. If we have a look kind of at their LinkedIn and the work that they've been doing now, they're really kind of ramping up what they're doing. But you've actually kind of been there since the beginning. So can you talk to us a little bit about, again, bringing over a company which was is Shopify in and of itself is so international. Founded by a German guy, but the headquarters is in Canada, and then so there's so many layers to the company. Can you talk to us a little bit about those things that you guys kept in mind, or that you learned during the time that you were launching Shopify?
Sure. I think I'm sure a lot of the viewers and listeners agree with me that, bringing a foreign business into Japan, there's a lot of that trust barrier. And in Japan, many of the businesses or services or products are built on customer trust, and that takes years to build. It doesn't happen automatically. Whereas if you're launching a service in Japan and it's Japanese, the trust element is already, the baseline is already there. So I think that in itself posed quite a few challenges. But the important thing about, I think, what I've learned about launching a business or foreign business in Japan is just really seeing the product from a customer perspective. So having that compassion perspective really does help in building a better product, building a better service, building a better community. And I think that compassion lens really sort of goes beyond the services. It really does speak to people directly. And so a lot of I used to take care of business development partnerships, product events, etc. But whenever, especially when we were hosting like community events, what I made sure of is that, you know, people were welcomed with empathy. They have millions of questions, obviously, because it's a foreign product that nobody knew about. So just having that that extra capacity to be more compassionate, I think, is the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. It's so interesting because when you think about it, you know, Shopify being this incredible platform that enables so many people to really democratizes, you know, retail in a way that, you know, for people that don't know, Shopify, it's, you know, essentially a platform that anyone can join as as a sole trader, even, and you know, you can and sell your goods. And as much as Japan is known for those huge brand names, you know, those Keiretsu companies, Toyota, Mitsubishi, you know, the backbone of the economy is very much like in other places where it's really those kind of small to medium enterprises that are really holding up the
Yeah,
economy. And so
yeah.
giving these people access to digitalization is so important. But we know the challenges to the e-commerce market. You know, in Japan, it's either, you know, like the lower customer adoption and things like that. Where do you think the role of, as you mentioned, how to build trust? Can you talk to us a little bit about those? Maybe even, you know, for people that are thinking that are in the same position as you, what are some of those tangible, concrete things that they might be able to do to build trust and empathy for a user or a client or a customer that maybe that maybe they don't know, right? And so that's really what is such a challenge. So what are some of those things that you did, really the strategies behind those things?
Right. One of the things that I did was, you know, when you're launching, well, at Shopify in the beginning, we didn't have a support team per se.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, when you're one of the first hires, you do have to wear many hats, and one of which involved answering support tickets. And I've learned so much from answering support tickets, and I've actually
Mm-hmm.
called I've I've called so many merchants who have left Shopify and who have been on Shopify for a while,
Mm-hmm.
to see how we can improve on our
Mm-hmm.
product, and
Mm-hmm.
what, most importantly, why they left, because that key element of as to why really
Mm-hmm.
gave me an idea of what kind of integrations we need, what kind of payments we need, what kind of
Mm-hmm.
you know, content we need. And so that being able to see it from a merchant perspective
Mm-hmm.
became absolutely key to building a better service in Japan.
Okay, and it sounds like it wasn't anything too complicated other than just talking to them. It didn't sound like that there was this, like, you know, very like complex, you know, customer survey or whatever. It was just like kind of you getting on the phone. Tell me what they said. I'm dying to know. What was some of the, like, what was some of the feedback that you got? Like obviously not everyone you know, had negative feedback. I'm sure there was a lot of positive feedback there as well. Can you give us a little bit of maybe the extreme cases that stood out to you?
Um, Primarily though, I think the issues were that, you know, the product was in English. It wasn't localized until 2018. And when I joined, it was 2017. And so, you know, everything was in English. And in Japan, you know, a lot of people have what I call an English allergy. And so when you look, when they look at an English dashboard, they automatically become quite overwhelmed, which is
Mm,
completely understandable. And
mm,
you know, if you're selling a product in Japan, you do need, you know, the right payment solution.
mm,
And because Japan has a pretty mature and developed payment, you know, community, that
mm,
we didn't have those either back then
mhm,
in July, I believe it was, in
mhm,
2017. So, you know, all of these little things that we definitely required. But, you know, luckily, so many people were very polite. They were talking to a complete stranger who called from like an unknown number, and but they they answered the phone, and they didn't yell at me, which I was very appreciative of them. Without, those people who churned Shopify, I don't think the product would have been as good as what it is now. So
Interesting. Okay, so the number one thing was like the non-English dashboard, which you can understand. I have to be honest, even though I speak, fluent Japanese and blah blah, all the rest of it, if I have an option to turn it to English, I always do. I
yeah,
always do it. So when I think there are some like companies or products that are launching abroad, and I understand that English, you're basically by native level English anyway. I don't know how you feel, but when it comes to things like money, bank interfaces, or things where I like can kind of, if I make a mistake, it's not great, i.e. transferring to the wrong bank account, or something like that, or
yeah.
insurance. I don't know. I'm like, okay, let me just make sure, let me make sure that this is in English so I can at least reduce my errors. That doesn't mean that I have zero errors, but it means I at least reduce them. I don't know if you had the
Mhm.
the same situation.
Oh, I definitely do. And funnily enough, I actually turn the dashboard into English. So when I am a Shopify user still, and I still belong to the Shopify community, and I help Japanese or foreign brands
Mm-hmm.
launch their product onto Shopify. Um, I still look at the dashboard in English, and then when I take screenshots, I turn it back to Japanese.
I think that's so funny. So tell me, when you talked about, obviously Shopify seeing like such growth over the last couple of years. Let's go back and talk a little bit about those building blocks, or what do you think, or what do you feel were those kind of elements of success that the team, obviously everything's a collaborative effort. What do you think the things were that the team did that that you guys are, or that Shopify is really reaping the benefits today? What do you think those things were?
um, I feel like I'm repeating myself at this point, but it was always the conversation that we've had was always like, what do merchants need? What do
Mhm.
they need to succeed? And how
And
can
what did they
we
need?
make there's so many things, when we say e-commerce, people often think, oh,
Mm,
it's just, buying products online, which is
yeah.
true. Like fundamentally, that's what it does.
Hmm.
But behind the scenes, there are things like, payments and
Mm,
customer management and, customer support and logistics and warehousing and, inventory, etc.
mm,
And
mhm,
all of these things really do take a lot of the time during your day to day. And so a lot of the bigger the company gets, they always have someone who's in charge of inventory, someone who's in charge of customer acquisition, someone's in charge of etc. But when you're launching a business, when you're a solopreneur,
mm,
there's not enough time during the day, right, to get around everything. So
mhm,
our thought process was, okay, like if you're a solopreneur and trying to launch a business, a successful one anyway, how can we make their lives easier
mhm,
by automating a lot of the things that typically takes a lot of time. One of the
mhm,
things being inventory management and warehousing. A lot of the e-commerce businesses, especially if you're a solopreneur, what they
mhm,
do is, because they want to minimize, spending more of their money into the e-commerce business, they actually handwrite
oh my God.
shipping information of every customer, and then they like box it at home, and that in itself really does take up a lot of time. And you know how Japanese addresses are full of like kanji, and you can't make a
Yeah.
mistake because that's rude if you do. And like so many of those things that actually can be automated.
Mhm,
So one of my key jobs while at Shopify was to find logistic partnerships so that
mhm,
everything um, from when customer orders product, that information will go then directly to the inventory management system, and then that
mhm,
information goes to the warehousing system, and then the product gets shipped to the customer all
mhm,
automatically, so they don't
mhm.
have to spend any more time writing shipping slips. you
Oh
know.
my God. Oh my
Yeah.
God. But one thing that seems to be synonymous with Japan when it comes to e-commerce is that they haven't implemented those simple solutions, or the, let's call them, the problems that have already been solved. There are many, problems that, that are common in e-commerce, that they're not particularly cultural, and that, we found solutions, but Japan is yet to implement them. Why do you think that they're a little bit slower when it comes to the implementation of these solutions that already exist in the market?
All right, that's a really good question. I think one of the things is, the bigger the brands,
Hmm.
um, they become a lot more risk averse. And like, I think Japan has a culture of being quite risk averse, and that's why insurance companies do so well here.
Right.
Um, but if the bigger companies are not willing to adopt new systems, then that sort of predetermines the future success of any sort of services or systems, right? And I think
Hmm.
that you know even with Shopify, and I work exclusively with pretty big companies, is
Hmm.
that they do take quite a long time to decide to migrate their e-commerce business onto Shopify, even though they know that it's better.
Hmm.
And I think that's so typical Japan sometimes, that they want to take a long time to decide, and they have to go through, so many departments to get an approval. But really, just that risk adverse mentality is
Mm.
where a lot of the foreign services, especially, struggle when they want to launch anything
Mm.
here and find their first customer. I think that's the
Mm.
biggest barrier there is.
I think that that's so interesting, and another thing that we've seen and kind of has come up a lot in the conversations recently has been Japan. Obviously, is the there's this obvious risk of adversity, but at the same time they're a big buy customer. They're like, if we buy it,
Hmm.
we want to implement it for 100,000 employees or 500,000 employees,
Yeah.
or whatever.
Yeah.
So as much as we have these small to medium enterprises that we talked about, when there's a large organization that you mentioned, that if they don't change their systems, obviously there's a lot of dependence within the economy that then depend on this particular company system. So if they don't change, then
Hmm.
the little mom and pop shops can't change either, because everything's kind of connected.
Hmm.
But then you have these big companies, and I feel that because you see these foreign startups that are coming to Japan with really premium products, but they can't serve the 500,000 people or the 300,000 people, or they can't do a complete organizational change. So they Japan is not
Hmm.
willing to do this kind of iterative rollout, like, okay, let's roll out in
Yeah.
phases. Okay, first let's do 1,000, then let's do 10,000, then let's do
Hmm.
35,000 or whatever. That they were like, no, we want to buy it, sign it off, and everyone has it kind of tomorrow. So I see
Yeah.
there's this kind of like risk adversity, but at the same time there's this kind of like gung-ho attitude that, like, if we're going to do it, everyone's on board, we're a rocket ship, let's go. Have you seen that as well?
Yeah, I think so. Especially now when I speak to clients, I work as a e-commerce consultant now, and they one of the the very common conversations that I have with them is that, once they migrate over to Shopify, they want to do this, they want to do that, and they want to incorporate this and that and this
Mm.
service and this tool and that tool. And every time I have this conversation, I have to say, like, okay, let's just let me just pause for
Yeah,
for
hang on.
for a second there. Let's start small. I am a huge fan of starting small. So let's
Mhm.
start small, and if we feel the need to migrate this over to this tool, we can discuss it then. But let's wait until we have enough data to back this migration up, so
Mhm.
that we're not wasting time, or, well, actually not me, but like the client isn't
Mm.
wasting money or time or resources into building another tool.
Mhm.
And that, I think that's a very, very common conversation that happens in Japan.
And how does the conversation go? So you tell them, hang on, let's wait. What's their response?
Actually, surprisingly pretty positive. I think I almost feel like it's a concept that they never really thought about before, because it's,
So then.
I think for them, it's always been like, all in or all out,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
In some aspects, I really do appreciate that mentality. But
Yeah, because you can get
when,
things done, right? Like when they're all in,
yeah,
they're all in. You can really like move, you can move quickly once they're on board.
yes, once everyone's on board. But I think, and then when I explain about, especially the money element of it, and the time management, I think they take a step back and
Mm.
they rethink about everything, and then they say, okay, that sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
So
So it's so important because when you're looking at this kind of e-commerce platform, you really don't just have that one customer. There's the end user, right? At the end of the day, which is who the Shopify
mm,
merchant is then selling to. But at the but then obviously your customer is also the merchant themselves, as well. So
mhm.
there's obviously a lot of success. Factors that go into kind of maintaining this harmonious ecosystem, and you mentioned that when we were preparing for this episode, you mentioned that there's a few key success factors for the merchants as well. Not only what Shopify's been doing in order to serve their clients, but there's also a few things that the merchants could do, or even other e-commerce providers, that when they're coming to Japan, that there's some certain things that they can keep in mind. The first of which being, copywriting isn't necessarily as straightforward as we originally thought. So maybe you want to walk us through that.
Sure, I actually wrote an article a few weeks ago, but um, I think if you look at a website's landing pages of, I think Spotify is a pretty good example. If you look at, the US Spotify site, the .com, and then if you look at the Japan Spotify homepage, the landing page, it looks so different.
Mm-hmm.
The UX isn't the same, the UI isn't the same, obviously, and a lot of the copy cannot be directly translated, and so localization is key. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we were launching Shopify's dashboard in Japanese, I was actually in the back end doing the actual translation of the words and the
Oh my
sentences, and
gosh. Yeah.
and so and one of the things that we often talked about is like, does this make sense? Like, is this contextual enough? Like, does this make sense? And it was one of the daily conversations, because it needs to take in the, is it keigo, is it
Mm.
a does it need to be formal, can it be informal, like what resonates better with Japanese merchants? And so we went
Mm-hmm.
into different e-commerce players dashboard, looked at it and understood their language, and then
Mm.
sort of brought that into Shopify when we were translating and essentially localizing. And so, I think it's very important to understand who your clientels are, who
Mm.
your users are if you're launching a service, and then understanding the type of language that they're comfortable with, and then adopting that when you're localizing a service. I think that's quite important, especially when you want to really build trust and connect with the user base.
Mm-hmm. Yes, as a in design thinking, this is kind of like first step is who are we serving, what are their
Mm,
needs, and then applying the solution. It's not necessarily about just letting a robot run loose in the wild and solve the problems. That's kind of not what
yeah.
it's about. It's just taking a step back and asking this person, what is it
Mm,
that you need, what are you looking for. And if we were to take this kind of a step further, and we think about, you've seen so much, you've seen different clients, you've seen different merchants, you've seen different industries, all within that e-commerce lens. What are the things that you can take away and say, okay, by no means is the Business Karaoke podcast a place for recommendations or anything like that, but what we do is just share anecdotal experiences. But what are the kind of like handful of things that you think, okay, this if you were going to give a really, you give your best effort in Japan, these are kinds of the things that we would look on. So obviously we've got to be really purposeful and really thoughtful about our copy. We've got to find ways to build trust. Maybe you can even talk a little bit more about different ways that we can build trust, especially if it's like in an e-commerce context. How we can do a better job at building trust online. And then maybe the other things that come to mind for you in terms of building a successful e-commerce strategy.
Right. So trust. Well, first of all, yes, copy, and also understand the customer base, like what's their age, what's their
Mm-hmm.
background, what kind of payment solutions do they feel the most comfortable in, because you want your customers to become a, not necessarily, money making is probably not the best word for it, but you want them to spend money essentially, right? And
Yeah, it
so
has to be a seamless kind of frictionless experience for them to do that.
exactly. So is it like carrier billing payments, like a lot of the younger people still use those solutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it, if they're younger and if they're more inclined to being like a hipster and they're more tech savvy, you will probably want Google Pay or Apple Pay. Like, so payment,
Mm-hmm.
just looking at payment really does make a difference. But then you also have to think about resources and time and money. And those three things are very important when you're, running any businesses. But with e-commerce, there are solutions that are already there that automates so much of the heavy load
Mm-hmm.
of what previous platforms or other platforms actually do not offer. But Shopify does, because of the many integrations that Shopify were able to build over the last few years. So utilizing automated solutions
Mm-hmm.
really does, at the end of the day, save a lot of money and time. And many people actually don't feel so comfortable investing in tools and products, but at the long term, you will save more money and more time and more resources in doing that. And then with also marketing, you know, we all know this, I'm sure, but we do need to understand what our products are, who we're selling it to, and how. And marketing is obviously the how part of it. And whether if it's Instagram or if it's Facebook or any sort of like social media, or if it's Google Ads, we need to know where our customers are
Mm-hmm.
and just blast information where they are, but
Mm-hmm.
also follow up with like breadcrumbs. So do we offer 10% discount for new customers, or
Mm-hmm.
ways to get them come back, because acquiring new customers is expensive, but
Mm-hmm.
getting back the retention rate is not as hard, especially in Japan. So,
Mm-hmm. What do you think the next kind of opportunities are for e-commerce? What are the things that you're really excited about? So you mentioned things like Apple Pay and Google Pay, and um, and obviously the Japanese payment systems being so reliant on legacy systems, and not being as agile or as flexible with other technologies. And so I can imagine that certainly, one thing, this kind of, integrated payment model, or, sharing data, things like that. But what for you do you see on the horizon, obviously knowing what you know about not only the Japanese market in terms of merchants, but also as their customers, their clients as well. What are the things that you think could really make their lives easier? What are those things that you're really excited about for e-commerce in Japan?
right. E-commerce is changing really, really quickly. And because of our current, COVID-19 climate, I think the changes that were meant to happen the next 10 years is happening within a very short few months.
Hmm.
And it's been quite an interesting journey being in the e-commerce industry, because so many more of the bigger merchants are interested in migrating over to actually to Shopify to relaunch their e-commerce business, because they understand that, at the end of the day, if their brick and mortar stores are not opening, then the e-commerce is really the only place where they can make money and sell products. And so actually, a lot of the payment solutions are more, I think, open to integrating into new systems, which is really a great thing. And not just that, but I think there are so many more tools and services that are dedicated for e-commerce merchants now more than ever, which will hopefully make more Japanese merchants interested in selling online and finding success on the internet world. And so there are more interesting things happening, and I think there are more things that we can explore. And I think one of the things that kind of shook the e-commerce industry just recently is Amazon has launched their Amazon luxury page, and I think Oscar de la Renta was one of the first clients. But that really shifts how the marketplaces are made, and that in itself, I think it is a step closer to what I called like a harmonized commerce. Right now we're saying headless, which basically means you can buy anything from anywhere, every touch point. But I think moving forward, it needs to be harmonized, which basically means if you go to Amazon or Rakuten or your own online store, all the information, UX, UI will be similar, and you'll have a very similar sort of experience buying it on your online store or Amazon or anywhere else. And I think that harmony builds more trust. It builds more empathy towards the brand, because you're being educated in terms of brand story, which is quite important in the e-commerce world. And so, yeah, I'm very excited to see how much change there will be within the next couple of years in terms of moving into hopefully harmonized commerce, and see how merchants go with it.
Right. So if we think about maybe the kind of two industries uh, that are really seeing, extreme changes, but that also are responding to those changes. We see the tech industry and we see e-commerce, which is one industry that you're in, but we also see this other industry, which is this mental health therapy area. And so if we talk about, and we've mentioned a few times, to get to know your user and empathy and things like that. Can we talk a little bit more now about how you transition your tech side, being like the e-commerce and the marketing into the therapy side?
Michelle, I think launching a business or building a business, or whatever realm of business you're in, one of the most important thing that I find is to really take a step back and think about, what your services are, who it's catered to, and what it's there for, like what are the issues that needs to be addressed. And I believe that therapy is something very similar, in a sense that you do have to take a step back from your day-to-day sometimes, and take a moment to yourself and think, who am I essentially, and understanding yourself, because understanding the product is important when you're launching a business, right? And understanding yourself is no different, as well. And so I think the more self-reflection you're able to do, you're actually able to contribute more to the growth of your company. And I believe those two needs to happen simultaneously, because oftentimes when people feel quite stagnant in the mental wellness sphere, they do feel stuck at work as well. And so those two things are not separate incidents, they're actually very much intertwined.
I think this is very interesting because in the West, there's this kind of idea about work-life balance, right? And work-life balance in the
Mhm.
West is that I have my work on one hand and I have my life on the other hand, and they're in equal balance, right? That I do
Yeah.
50% here and I do 50% there. Whereas
Mhm.
my anecdotal experience of work-life balance in Japan is work in Japan, or work-life balance in Japan is my work relationships and my life relationships are equally good. So there's no, it's less
Mm.
about, kind of time splitting and things like that. It's that, am I happy at work and am I happy at home? There's none of this kind of separation. It's more like the blend, like how well have I blended my work and my life, versus in the West, it's
Mm.
how well have I separated kind of my work and my life. And
Mhm.
one thing that, just to touch on as well, that you mentioned, you've got to understand kind of who you are, what you're selling. I think this is so much, what you just mentioned with a brand story. And if we've ever seen an economy that's just, made for the luxury industries, it's Japan. Like Japan loves, like the luxury things, the seasonal goods and things like that. But it depends on how well you can sell that story. What's the story? Louis Vuitton's done an incredible group, or the Louis Vuitton group has an incredible
Mm.
job in being able to sell, the Louis Vuitton story in Japan. Japan is such a strong market
Mm.
for Louis Vuitton. Um, and then if we also, look at that personal side of things, okay, telling your personal story and seeing that as well. And if we think about now, like with this COVID-19, and we can't necessarily separate our lives as much anymore.
Mm.
We the same table that we have a conversation with our boss, our clients, or our employees at is the same maybe desk or chair that you have your dinner at as well. Maybe
Yeah.
so it's kind of difficult. The lines are being blurred, and there's a lot of kind of stress for people. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in your clients, what's been their stresses, maybe some coping strategies, just to kind of frame the COVID-19 thing for us a little bit?
Sure. So recently I was reading an article that came out, and the Japanese university who's doing the research on it
Mhm.
call it coronavirus-induced altered mental status. And what that essentially means is that, more people feel stressed or depressed,
Mhm.
due to, COVID-19. And that's not, obviously a Japan only phenomenon, but it's a
Mhm.
global one. And one of the most asked questions during, I think, the first couple of months of the outbreak of the pandemic was point blank, literally, I don't know what to do. And uh,
This is
and
knowing laughter. I don't think this is funny. This is knowing.
it's yes, and I believe that, many people felt very similar.
Mm.
And a couple of reasons why. And before COVID, everything that we knew, um, were a norm to us. But since COVID-19 broke out, whatever we knew as normal were no longer normal for us. And adapting to a new norm, actually, what it does is it introduces us to our own conditioning.
Mhm.
And conditioning is something that's been built over the years. Some
Mm.
people have really strong conditionings from when they were a child, or it could be cultural belief systems, and we do develop these patterns over the years, and we're actually, patterns are run on autopilot. So we wake up in the
Mhm.
morning, we brush our teeth. That's our pattern, that's our conditioning. We don't really think about it. And with COVID, with the new norm, we were actually forced into thinking about our past norms and how it doesn't serve us. So how can we, confront our conditioning and patterns and break them in order to relearn a new pattern? And I
Mhm.
think that's where people felt the most confused, because they
Mhm.
never had to perhaps do the work or be exposed to certain ideas.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I think that's been the biggest challenge for
Yeah.
many people.
And it's interesting. So if we also take kind of the business lens, lots of people thought, okay, well, kind of once you got kind of hit in the face with the COVID baseball bat, you're like, okay, well, we have to do something. And so people just kind of went online and just kind of tried to replicate their existing services, but just on Zoom or whatever it was. And then you kind of recognize, this isn't really it either, right? So it's not simply about, okay, let's just take what we used to know, which is what you mentioned, like our patterns, and then let's just kind of do it online. Actually, we have to reconstruct it from the beginning. So for example, if your business is events, you can't simply just run the normal event that you would usually run and just run it online and just have everyone, do whatever it is that you have them do, in their own home. You have to completely rethink, how can we build this digital experience for this person from the ground up, and that I think is really confronting, not only for a lot of people, but but also businesses as well, to think, okay, everything that we've done, what do we do? What do we take forward? What do we let go? And I think that's maybe also a confusing point for people. It's, how can we be inspired by our past, by our traditions, by our clients, by our relationships, but then how can we translate that into some kind of digital action or some kind of new action that's kind of required of us in this very challenging time?
It is true. Yeah, I think that's one of the most challenging, like breaking the pattern, and understanding our past, is quite challenging for many, because I think popular culture is, let's not care about the past, let's just look at the present and move forward with it. But usually, moving forward, and I say this in my for my clients a lot, is that trying not to think, um and this is going to get deep really really quickly, but
Oh, I'm all about
don't
that.
try.
Go. I'm all about it.
I love it. Don't see life from the perspective of life. Try and see life from the perspective of death. And I say this because
Wait. Say that again. Say it slowly, so make sure everyone here. Don't see life from the perspective of life, but see it from
life.
from the perspective of death. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dive
Yeah.
in. Let's go. What?
Okay.
Talk us through it.
And I say this because when you look at life from a perspective of life, it's almost like looking at business from a perspective of moving forward, right?
Oh
Like
my
forward,
God.
forward, forward.
Rieko, this is exactly it. Don't, build your forecasts on, when the economy is growing, like, okay.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we need to, like, I think oftentimes with so much content, with so much social media going on, and a lot of it's more about, let's move forward, let's look at the future and plan our future. But really, like with COVID, what happened was, like, we couldn't really plan a future because everything was all of a sudden became unpredictable, and it still is. And so, when you look at life from a perspective of life, it's like abundance of possibilities, and it's true, like life has abundance of possibilities. When you, it gets like take that out of the context and put it into the context of business, when you're succeeding, you look at success from a perspective of success, like, and the projections are going to look spectacular, but is that how it's going to be? Like, probably not. Things are going really well now, so I'm just going to look at the future projections from where I am now, and then predict how successful my company is going to be. But that really never applies in most cases. And when I put that into the perspective of the coaching and therapy space, is that things may be going really well for you now, but you don't really know. There's no guarantee in life. There's no guarantee in stability, and so you need to really change that perspective and look at it from the perspective of death. Like, how do you want your thoughts to be when you're lying on your deathbed? Like, who do you want to be around? How do you want to be perhaps remembered? And what do you want to cherish the most and treasure the most? And then, plan who you want to be, as opposed to what you want to do. And this is one of the common topics that I spoke about during COVID, is that, to-dos, there's no guarantee in to-dos. I want to I don't know, bake a cake tomorrow, but then
Uh-huh.
your oven might break, and you may not be able to
Mhm.
check that to do. But if you base your future plans on who you want to be, then all your to dos become your intentions.
Mhm.
So you're no longer thinking about the small to dos, but you're more living within your intention. So there's that inner alignment there,
Right.
and I
Well,
think that's
yeah. It's the idea that there's this idea of, if you focus on the who you want to be rather than what you want to do, you become a little bit more flexible with what those to-dos are. So
exactly.
if your goal is I want to bake a cake, well, if your oven blows up, well, you're in trouble and then you feel like a failure. But if you're like, goal was I want to, feed a delicious meal to my family, or I want to cook for my family or whatever, then you have a little bit more, move, mobility
Like
room,
with
because it's not.
room. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And also when you mentioned that don't simply plan for good because good can end, also the opposite is true, isn't it? Bad ends. Don't plan your life
Mhm.
based on the fact that you've just lost $500,000 of business during this period of COVID, or something. Like, don't, that's not gonna be the rest of your life story. So I guess the opposite is true as well, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. And I think we learn so much more from, failures. Well, I don't necessarily call it failures, but, mishaps than success, right? And I think that's the same for business and in life, is that, when you hit a brick wall, you think, okay, what went wrong? Um,
That's my
and
second
I, and
thought. It's
I,
my first thought is cheese. My second thought is what.
that's true. Need a glass of wine. But then I think that's where people get really creative. Like, how
Mm,
how do you climb the wall? Do you climb it? Do you dig a hole under it? Like, do you paint it? Like, there's so many, I think, ways that people can move forward from adversity, and there's so much more
mm,
to learn from adversities than from success. And oftentimes, when I speak to people who have gone through hardships and what I call it, like, blood from their heart, I think they have this, like, depth, in terms of personality. And I don't think business is far off. Like,
mm,
if your business have survived, the mountains and the hills, like, the more depth and the more, um I guess, like, intertwined they are with people, and with people meaning with compassion. And I think
mm,
COVID is a really, I don't want to say it's a great opportunity, but it is an opportunity to kind of take a step back and think about, okay, what can I do? How can I reflect this? And
mm.
how can I, implement the reflections into my day to day or into my business?
So it's nice to, I guess, as humans, what we want to know is that, we're not alone. So I guess that there's like lots of people are dealing with all different kinds of problems. What are the other issues or challenges or commonalities or patterns even, that you've kind of recognized or heard from your clients?
Right. A lot of people are now, I think, in the moment of self-doubt. And that's also very common because, we were never given a situation on a mass scale where we had to stay home and deal with our own thoughts. That's challenging for so many people because we're not used to that, right? And so, million thoughts happening, sometimes good, sometimes bad, sometimes terrible. And we have to learn to control our mind, and that's one of the hardest things. And when you were able to perhaps go to the office or go to meetings, and those things really does give us a time out from our own thoughts.
Mm,
But now, not so much. And So
Right.
yeah, that's one of the things that I think many people are finding it to be
Right.
quite challenging.
And we were laughing because this explains all like the baking behavior, right? Like of people, let me do something, constantly thinking. What can you talk to us a little bit about the benefits of staying in your own thoughts rather than going to bake another banana bread? And the benefits and also how to do it.
Right. Benefits, well, there's so many actually, and I welcome this change because it was much needed, I think. And being exposed to your own thought gives an opportunity to find your patterns and conditionings.
Mm,
And these are very, very important because when you look at it, and this goes from personal to business as well, that we all have patterns, and some patterns work for us, like waking up in the morning, brushing your teeth, and perhaps singing a song for yourself. Like that works, but some patterns really don't. And
mm,
um, and I think I'm trying to think of an example, but when you're having a not so good day
mm,
and you're left with your own thoughts,
mm,
oftentimes what happens is that that thought process goes down spiral,
mm,
and it takes more time to get out of it than to stay in your own thoughts. So what happens then often is you stay in that thought, that negative thought, and worst case scenario, you may experience some level of panic or anxiety,
mm,
and that takes maybe hours or a few days to get out
mm,
of, for you to feel normal again. And and in that moment, what you can realize is that, okay, I'm going down spiral. Why is this thought happening? Where is this coming from? Where did it stem from? And you do need to deep dive into, it sounds really weird. You're already deep diving into your thought, but you do need to deep dive into your patterns and conditionings then too.
mm,
And oftentimes where that comes from is your childhood. Perhaps your negative thoughts weren't necessarily being embraced by your primary caregivers, and therefore, you know, you don't know how to control
mm,
your negativity.
mm,
Um, and so going back into your childhood essentially, and then being able to reparent yourself really does help. And that not only helps you in that moment, but it really does help you become the person who you really want to be.
mhm. When I think about, COVID is a kind of like a very extreme situation that we all have to kind of deal with our own thoughts. But one situation that people who are listening to this podcast know on a probably most of their lives is when you're abroad and you live in a country that's not kind of native to you, there
Mm-hmm,
is something similar to, that's required of you
mm-hmm,
as kind of what COVID is asking you to do. And one of those things for me is how do you keep moving forward, right? Keep moving forward. The circumstances around you, you didn't choose them, right? COVID, we didn't choose COVID. Lots of people that are foreigners living in Japan, or for example, people like yourself that are Japanese and living abroad, you didn't ask why do Australians do these crazy things. And, if you had a trauma every single time that an Australian was late to a meeting or something, you know what I mean? Like that'd be really difficult, so it's about this, this interesting kind of mix of, obviously I'm not comparing living abroad to like living in a pandemic, but there are certain elements or characteristics that you've built when you've lived abroad that actually are
mm-hmm,
translatable in this kind of like pandemic time, which is how can I develop my own set of tools and skills about me to kind of move forward. And I think, we've all kind of had it, that you've got to catch yourself. Like I'm sure that people have had it. You're either sitting, it can be bizarre. Maybe you're at work, you're in the elevator, and then all of a sudden you have this one thought and you think, why do I live in Japan? Why am I here? Or maybe you're in this, maybe you're Japanese and you're in the States and you think, what am I doing? Is this the right choice for my, and you have these bizarre kind of thoughts that take you on a rocket ship kind of somewhere else. And to be able to kind of control them is so important. And then when you mentioned that you've got to find a ways to, to be that person that you want to be, because if you're living abroad or living in a pandemic, now I am comparing them, you've got to show up kind of as that best person, not only for you, but for those around you,
Mm.
as well. So when you talked about being able to kind of like identify your patterns, is there anything specific that someone could do? Like, should they write down like a journal or something, like when they're having one of those moments? Shall they do like a flow kind of thought, like this is what I'm feeling? Or is there anything or any specific ways that someone would be able to identify their patterns?
Yeah, one of the key emotion I believe is anger. So when you
Oh.
feel anger, it's nice to write them down. And
Mm,
it will, first of all, it helps you calm down, and that's always a positive. So your nervous system are more serene. And but also anger is a very interesting emotion, and it triggers so many um, stimuli in your hormones. And it teaches you a lot more about yourself than I think often people perceive. And anger stems from your upbringing most of the time,
mm,
and that's a very, very, very strong belief system and also
mm,
conditioning. So understanding why you're angry and where it comes from, not just on the surface level, but from the perspective of your past, really does help identify a lot of the patterns that you already have, and also gives you an idea of how to break them. And during COVID, I'm sure we all read the news that many people wanted to get a divorce, and the divorce rate spiked.
mm.
And I think if people knew how to manage their anger and knew where it was coming from, that divorce rate would have been reduced. And I really do believe that, because when you're living with somebody, not just your own thought that you're not used to, but then you're living with someone who's not also used to their own thought, you know um it's it's a natural course that we get frustrated and want to take that anger out on somebody. And anger often comes out in intimate relationships. That could be your family, your partner, your primary caregiver. It could be anybody. But the more intimate it is, the easier it'll be, expressed. And so when you're feeling that level of anger, write it down. Write down why, how it happened, and where you think that stems from. And you have to, and it's uncomfortable, I admit, but because you have to sort of swim in the pool of anger within your mind. But that really, I think, helps understand your perhaps your childhood hurt or pain, and then be able to embrace that. And then in the future, you'll be able to control your anger a lot better and a lot more efficiently.
I think that that's so important, because there really is that parallel between how we deal with crises in our personal lives, but also in our business lives. If we take a situation in business that's not going well, the first thing that we have to do is press the pause button, and then kind of
Mhm.
analyze the situation. What's going on? What can we do? Is there anything from our side? And then obviously that's something we can do in our personal lives as well. Okay, if we're in a situation that we don't want to be in for whatever reason, press the pause button, and then begin with the analysis of yourself. And then also kind of circling back to one of your initial points, which was, how can we develop then empathy for the other person? So whether that's you're building copy, or maybe you're even, for example, in your case, you're in the customer support room and you're apologizing on the phone, rather than you getting on the phone saying, well, it wasn't my fault. Like, I didn't break the order or whatever it is. That's not helpful to the person. So if we think a little bit about, okay, how can we be supportive of this person? How can we help them? And then develop that empathy for them. It seems like that might be something that's helpful in both our professional and personal lives.
Yeah, 100%. And you touch on something super important. Again, is that understanding your past is actually one of the biggest compassion you can give to yourself. And if you can't give empathy or compassion to yourself, there's no way you can give it to other people. And I
Mm.
think in oftentimes in business, especially, compassion is there's a misconception of compassion. A lot of people take it as like a might.
So
Um,
like kind of almost
yeah,
like a
as
weakness in a way. Yeah.
yes, yeah, as opposed to strength. But compassion is actually one of the most courageous acts you can give to yourself and to others. Like compassion doesn't mean someone made a mistake, huge mistake in a business
Mm.
setting, and you don't give feedback. Like that's not compassion. That's just
Mm.
letting someone be, and that's a might. But giving a compassionate, constructive feedback, um, that's courage and that's kindness. And so, what COVID is trying to, I think, teach us is to learn how to give that level of compassion and empathy towards yourself, by understanding our patterns and conditionings. And therefore, when you're faced with someone who are going through something similar or going through frustrations or you know sadness or anything really, like you're able to extend the empathy that you were giving to yourself to other people. And I think that's what's most required during this time, because it's so easy to feel alone and isolated, or misunderstood, especially with Zoom calls. It's hard
Mm.
to completely grasp what the other person's going through. But
Mm.
having that level of empathy and compassion towards yourself, you're then able to have the capacity to give the same to others. And that's, I think that's one of the biggest lessons and takeaways from this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Is to how to learn to be that, go back to what you mentioned, which was living for as the person who you want to be, not necessarily what those things are, and then seeing, how that then can translate into both your personal and professional lives. That's I can't find a better or a more appropriate um, place to kind of make a pause, because I have so much more that I would love to talk to you about, but we're going to have to do that when you come back for your second episode. Um, but before we do that, is there anything that you want to leave the people with that we haven't quite mentioned yet?
um I think, if you're struggling with COVID, we all are.
Hmm.
So try and reach out. And I've some of my clients have been scared to reach out to others, but reaching out is actually an act of compassion for yourself. So I challenge everybody to do that. And then don't be afraid to say, I don't feel well, like I'm not well. And that's completely okay, whether it being in business or in your personal life too. And so I would love for, and I think like partly the reason why you've been so great at, having these talks is, essentially, I think what you're doing is building a compassionate and empathetic community, of people who wants to support one another. And so
Mm.
I would love for, all the viewers and listeners to utilize what you've built, and reach out within the community, because I believe that you have built such a warm environment for people to thrive in and feel better about themselves and about their business. So just wanted to take
Oh
this
my gosh,
moment
Reiko,
to
I'm
thank
gonna
you
cry.
for doing that.
And it's so funny that you mentioned that, because this, funnily enough, kind of was my coping mechanism. I could have started this podcast kind of 3 years ago when I started, really, scaling our work in innovation, but I didn't. It wasn't until I felt this, the quarantine and the disconnection from people, that I thought, I can't live another day if I'm not connected to kind of my peers and my colleagues. And there's been so much, where I kind of, I think, gee, why didn't I do this earlier? Why didn't, but I couldn't, things, things were fine. And I guess this is maybe, my learning. And I stupidly said this actually to myself after the Japanese earthquake. So in 2011, I was on the 20th floor. Were you in Tokyo then, or were you in Melbourne? To
I was in
or were you in
Melbourne.
Australia? Yeah. So I was in Tokyo at that time, And one of my takeaways for like from the earthquake was, being in the 20th floor and my boss screaming, "We're all gonna die," which is the most stupidest thing.
Oh no.
I know, can't believe that was my leadership. Like after the shaking stopped, he said, "I thought we were all gonna die. Shinotomotta."
Oh goodness.
So that's what he said. Anyway, and then in that moment, I thought, oh my gosh, why did I wait? And then afterwards, everyone calls their families and says, "I love you," and things like that. And I thought, why
Mm,
did I wait until this earthquake happened until I acted? And I said to myself, I'm not going to wait. But then I think, as humans, and that was very true for like a couple of years, but I think, as you kind of get used to it, things go back to
mm,
normal. But then this was like another reminder, like stay awake, keep working, and as you mentioned, don't live from the perspective of life, live from the perspective of death, because then you start thinking about what is it that I can leave people, who do I want to be, and that's really exciting. And I'd encourage people to find their own way. Everyone's way is different. Not everyone is a painful extrovert like me and I have to connect to people and have a podcast. Not everyone needs that. Maybe you just can have a journal and you're happy. I wish I could only have a journal, but I can't. I have to have a podcast.
no, this is great. Your
Uh,
podcast's great. So
so I just hope that people find their own ways that's tailored for them, and then, to help them grow and then take that energy into their business life and then, thrive there as well.
definitely, definitely.
Rieko, on that point, I'd like to thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to hear even just the tip of the iceberg of information that you are. I can't wait to have another
Mm.
conversation with you.
Thank you so much for your time and for having me.